The morning sun streamed through the airport's giant windows as travelers rushed back and forth, dragging their wheeled suitcases across the shiny floor. Among them walked a well-dressed black man in his mid-30s, pulling his carry-on bag with one hand while checking his phone with the other. He'd done this walk 1,000 times before, but today he wasn't wearing his usual pilot's uniform. Instead, he wore a comfortable gray sweater and dark jeans, perfect for a long flight as a passenger. As one of the most experienced commercial airline pilots in the country, with over 15 years of flying under his belt, he knew every corner of this airport like the back of his hand. But today was different. Today, he was heading home to surprise his mom for her birthday, taking a regular commercial flight like any other passenger. Walking up to the first-class counter, he pulled out his ticket and ID. The ground staff member did a double take, glancing between his face and his first-class ticket several times. "Oh, are you sure you're on the right line?" she asked, her voice dripping with doubt. He smiled politely, something he'd learned to do countless times before. "Yes, I am. First-class ticket, seat 2A, he replied calmly, sliding his ID and ticket across the counter. The staff member's cheeks turned pink as she verified his information, mumbling a quiet apology before processing his boarding pass. This wasn't anything new to him. As one of the few black commercial airline pilots in the country, he'd faced similar situations throughout his career. But he never let it get to him. His love for flying and his professional dedication always rose above the prejudice. Boarding began right on schedule. As he walked down the jet bridge, he could feel the familiar excitement building up, that special feeling that came with flying, whether he was in the cockpit or not. The smell of aircraft fuel and the sound of the auxiliary power unit humming in the background felt like home. At the aircraft door, 2 flight attendants greeted passengers with practiced smiles, but when he showed his boarding pass, their expressions shifted ever so slightly. The taller flight attendant's smile became fixed and artificial, while her colleague's eyes narrowed just a fraction. "First class is this way, sir," the first flight attendant said, her tone carrying a hint of suspicion that most people might miss. But he caught it. He'd heard it too many times before. Making his way to his seat, he could feel their eyes following him. He stored his carry-on in the overhead bin and settled into the comfortable leather seat. Around him, other first-class passengers were arranging their belongings and making themselves comfortable. A businessman in an expensive suit took the seat across the aisle, receiving a warm, genuine smile from the same flight attendant who had just questioned his presence. As more passengers boarded, he noticed the flight attendants making several passes through the first-class cabin, their gazes repeatedly falling on him. They whispered to each other near the galley, throwing glances his way when they thought he wasn't looking. During the pre-flight service, when the flight attendants offered welcome drinks to first-class passengers, their interaction with him was noticeably different. While other passengers received warm, personalized service, his interaction was cold and mechanical. "Would you like something to drink?" the flight attendant asked, her voice flat and professional, a stark contrast to the friendly chatter she shared with other passengers. "Water, please," he replied with a gentle smile. She returned with his water, placing it on his tray table without a word, before turning to the businessman across the aisle with a bright smile. "Here's your champagne, sir. Please let me know if you need anything else." The contrast was clear, but he remained composed. Years of experience had taught him that reacting would only make things worse. Instead, he pulled out his book, a technical manual about the very type of aircraft he was sitting in. He'd been studying it to prepare for an upcoming training session he would be conducting for new pilots. A few minutes later, he overheard one flight attendant say to another, "We should double-check the passenger manifest. Make sure everyone is in their assigned seats." Their eyes darted toward him again, making it clear who they were talking about. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a senior airline captain with thousands of flight hours, certified to fly this exact aircraft model, being viewed with suspicion simply because of how he looked. He could have said something, could have pulled out his pilot's ID or mentioned his profession. But he didn't. Experience had taught him that sometimes the best lessons come when people realize their mistakes on their own. As the boarding process continued, he observed the crew's interactions with other passengers. They were warm and welcoming to everyone else, offering assistance with bags, providing extra pillows without being asked, and engaging in friendly conversation. Meanwhile, they seemed to be watching him from the corner of their eyes, as if expecting him to cause trouble. A young woman took the seat next to him, and immediately one of the flight attendants rushed over. "Ma'am, if you'd like, we can find you another seat," she whispered, not quite quietly enough to prevent him from hearing. The woman looked confused, glanced at him, then back at the flight attendant. "No, thank you," she replied firmly, giving him a friendly smile as she settled into the seat. "I'm perfectly comfortable here." The flight attendant's face flushed as she hurried away. He exchanged a knowing look with his seatmate, appreciating her simple act of dignity. As the final preparations for takeoff began, he noticed small details about the aircraft that only a pilot would recognize. The slight difference in the engine sound, the specific way the flaps moved during their pre-flight check. These were things he usually monitored from the cockpit. Today, he was just another passenger, albeit one who understood every bump, every sound, and every movement of the aircraft intimately. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their flight time and route. To most passengers, it was routine information, but he could hear something in the captain's voice that others might miss, a slight tension that suggested the weather might be more challenging than usual. Looking out his window, he could see dark clouds gathering in the distance. His experienced eye told him they were in for some turbulence later in the flight. He made a mental note to keep his seatbelt fastened, even when the sign was off. Another habit from his years of flying. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, he couldn't help but smile at the irony of his situation. The same crew members who were viewing him with suspicion had no idea that he probably had more experience with this aircraft than their own pilots. But he remained quiet, knowing that sometimes the most powerful statements are made without saying a word. Little did anyone know that this flight would become much more than just another story about prejudice. In a few hours, these same flight attendants who were now watching him with suspicious eyes would be thanking him for saving their lives. But for now, he simply opened his book, buckled his seatbelt, and prepared for takeoff, just like any other passenger on any other flight. The engines roared to life, and the aircraft began its taxi to the runway. Despite everything, he felt that familiar thrill of flying, the same feeling that had made him fall in love with aviation as a child. No amount of prejudice or suspicious glances could take that away from him. As the aircraft lined up on the runway, he settled back in his seat, knowing that this flight would turn out to be anything but ordinary. The aircraft reached its cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. A subtle shift in the engine noise told the experienced pilot that they were leveling off at 35,000 feet, something most passengers wouldn't notice, but to him, it was as clear as day. He closed his technical manual and gazed out the window at the clouds below, taking in the familiar view from an unfamiliar angle. The first-class cabin settled into its usual routine. Passengers typed away on laptops or dozed off in their comfortable seats. The businessman across the aisle had already fallen asleep, his expensive noise-canceling headphones slightly askew. The young woman next to him was deeply engrossed in a mystery novel. The drink service began, and he watched as the flight attendants worked their way through the cabin. Their practiced movements reminded him of the countless times he'd seen them during his own flights, though usually through the cockpit door during his pre-flight checks. When they reached his row, the taller flight attendant's smile remained frozen and artificial. "What would you like to drink?" she asked, her tone noticeably cooler than it had been with other passengers. "Coffee, please." "Black," he replied with a gentle smile. She nodded curtly and moved to his seatmate. "And for you, ma'am? We had a lovely selection of wines today, or perhaps you'd like to try our signature cocktail." The young woman glanced at him, then back at the flight attendant, clearly noticing the difference in treatment. "Just coffee as well, thank you," she said, her tone carrying a hint of disapproval at the disparity. When the drinks arrived, his coffee was placed on his tray table with barely a glance, while his seatmate received a napkin, a cookie, and a warm smile. He noticed a few other passengers watching the interaction, some with furrowed brows and uncomfortable expressions. The cabin grew chilly as the flight progressed, and several passengers asked for blankets. He observed as the flight attendants cheerfully distributed them, engaging in friendly chat with each person. When it was his turn to ask, he pressed the call button. The second flight attendant appeared, his professional mask barely concealing his annoyance. "Yes, sir?" "Could I get a blanket, please?" The flight attendant's response was barely audible. "Let me check if we have any left." He disappeared into the galley, where his whispered conversation with his colleague carried just far enough. The high-maintenance ones always want extra attention. A few minutes later, a blanket was practically tossed onto his lap without a word. The businessman across the aisle, who had woken up and witnessed the exchange, raised his eyebrows in surprise. An elderly woman seated 2 rows ahead turned around and caught his eye. She gave him a sympathetic smile and a small shake of her head, clearly disapproving of the crew's behavior. He responded with a slight shrug and a gentle smile, a wordless exchange that spoke volumes. The flight attendants continued their subtle but persistent display of bias. When they came through with hot towels, they'd barely extended their arms toward him, making him reach uncomfortably far. During the meal service, while other passengers were asked about their preference between chicken and pasta, with detailed descriptions of each dish, he received a curt chicken or pasta. He chose the pasta, and when it arrived, it was practically slid onto his tray table. No offer of bread, no inquiry about a drink refill, none of the little extras that other passengers received automatically. His seatmate noticed this too, and deliberately shared her warm bread roll with him, a small gesture of solidarity that meant more than she probably realized. The meal service continued, and he couldn't help but notice how the flight attendants kept glancing at him, especially when he reached into his bag to get his phone. Their bodies would tense slightly, their movements becoming more alert, as if expecting trouble. He pretended not to notice, maintaining his calm demeanor while messaging his mom about his surprise visit. A bit of turbulence started to rock the plane, causing the seatbelt sign to illuminate. He noticed it wasn't normal turbulence. There was something about the way the aircraft was handling that felt off to his trained senses. The engines had a slightly different pitch, barely noticeable to most but clear as day to someone who had spent thousands of hours in the cockpit. During this time, he observed the flight attendants struggling to maintain their balance as they cleared meal trays. One of them nearly stumbled, and without thinking, he reached out to steady a falling glass. Instead of thanks, he received a suspicious glare, as if his help was unwelcome. More passengers began to notice the crew's behavior. A businessman in the second row had been watching the interactions with increasing discomfort. During a quiet moment, he leaned across the aisle and spoke in a low voice. "Their behavior is unacceptable. You should report this." He smiled politely and shook his head. "Sometimes the best response is no response at all," he replied quietly. "Things have a way of working themselves out." The turbulence increased, and he could hear worried murmurs from other passengers. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts with varying degrees of courtesy. When they reached his row, the check was perfunctory at best, barely a glance in his direction. He noticed more subtle signs that something wasn't quite right with the aircraft. The pitch of the engines had changed again, and there was a slight vibration that shouldn't be there. His years of experience told him this wasn't just normal turbulence, something else was going on. The captain's voice came over the intercom, attempting to sound calm but carrying an undertone of concern that only an experienced pilot would recognize. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." The flight attendants retreated to their jump seats, whispering to each other and occasionally throwing glances his way. They had no idea that the man they'd been treating with such suspicion was probably the most qualified person on the aircraft to understand what was really happening. He caught fragments of their whispered conversation. "Never had a first-class passenger like. Should keep an eye on. Maybe we should move some people." Each comment made their prejudices clearer, even as the situation aboard the aircraft was becoming increasingly serious. The young woman next to him gripped her armrests as another wave of turbulence shook the plane. "Is this normal?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. He was about to respond when a distinctive sound from the engines caught his attention. His expression remained calm, but internally, his pilot's instincts were on high alert. He knew that sound, and it wasn't good. Whatever was happening, it was more serious than mere turbulence. Little did the flight attendants know that their prejudices were about to be challenged in the most dramatic way possible. The man they had spent the last few hours treating with suspicion would soon become their only hope for survival. But for now, he remained silent, watching and waiting as the situation continued to unfold. 3 hours into the flight, the situation began to change dramatically. The experienced pilot sitting in first class noticed at first a subtle but distinct change in the aircraft's engine sound that made his trained ears perk up. Something wasn't right, and he knew it in his bones. The sound reminded him of an incident from his early flying days when a similar aircraft had developed mechanical problems over the Pacific. He'd studied that case extensively during his training, and now those same warning signs were presenting themselves at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. The cabin lights flickered briefly, causing several passengers to look up from their books and tablets. The businessman across the aisle pulled off his headphones, glancing around with mild concern. The young woman next to him gripped her armrest tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Before he could respond, the aircraft shuddered violently. Drinks spilled, phones clattered to the floor, and a few passengers gasped. The seatbelt sign chimed on immediately, accompanied by the captain's voice over the intercom. To most passengers, the captain sounded calm and professional, but to his experienced ear, there was an unmistakable strain in the voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, please take your seats." He knew this wasn't just turbulence. The vibration pattern was all wrong, and the pitch of the engines had changed in a way that sent alarm bells ringing in his mind. His hands instinctively moved as if reaching for controls that weren't there, muscle memory from countless hours in the cockpit kicking in. The flight attendants who had been so cold to him earlier now moved through the cabin with forced smiles, checking seatbelts and securing loose items. Their professional masks couldn't quite hide their growing anxiety. He noticed how their hands trembled slightly as they worked, how they exchanged worried glances when they thought no one was watching. Another violent shake rocked the aircraft. An overhead bin popped open, sending a carry-on bag tumbling into the aisle. The lead flight attendant stumbled, catching herself on a seatback. The fear in her eyes was now evident, her earlier prejudices forgotten in the face of growing danger. Through the window, he could see the right engine behaving unusually. The subtle vibration he'd noticed earlier had become more pronounced, and there was a slight discoloration in the exhaust, something only an experienced pilot would recognize as trouble. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time with an edge that made several passengers exchange worried looks. "Flight attendants, please come to the cockpit immediately." As the flight attendants hurried forward, he noticed their barely concealed panic. The same crew members who had been watching him suspiciously all flight were now speed-walking past him, their faces pale with worry. He could hear fragments of their whispered conversation. "Never seen this before, both of them. What are we going to do?" The aircraft lurched again, more violently this time. A chorus of frightened gasps filled the cabin. An elderly man across the aisle began reciting prayers under his breath. A young mother a few rows back held her child close, whispering soothing words that didn't match her terrified expression. He remained calm, his mind already running through possible scenarios and solutions. Years of flight training and emergency simulations had prepared him for moments like this. He noticed details that other passengers missed, the specific way the aircraft was handling, the particular sequence of sounds from the engines, the slight changes in cabin pressure that made his ears pop. A flight attendant emerged from the cockpit, her face ashen. She whispered something to her colleague, and both their expressions turned to pure fear. They huddled near the galley, having what they thought was a private conversation, but his keen ears caught fragments. "Food poisoning. Both of them need a doctor." The reality of the situation became clear to him. Both pilots were incapacitated. The aircraft was experiencing mechanical issues, and they were over the Atlantic Ocean, hours from the nearest airport. He watched as the flight attendants began moving through the cabin, their voices shaking as they asked if anyone had flying experience. They were trying to be discreet, trying not to cause panic, but their fear was palpable. Passengers began to whisper among themselves, theories and worried speculation spreading through the cabin like wildfire. The young woman next to him grabbed his arm during another bout of turbulence. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He patted her hand reassuringly, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos around them. "Everything will be fine," he said with quiet confidence. He knew what he had to do, but he waited for the right moment. Let them ask, let them realize their mistake on their own. The aircraft shuddered again, and this time the drop in altitude was noticeable. Several passengers screamed. The businessman who had been sleeping earlier was now fully awake and clutching his armrests, his face pale with fear. Through it all, he remained composed, his trained eyes taking in every detail, his experienced mind already formulating a plan. The same flight attendants who had treated him with suspicion would soon learn a powerful lesson about prejudice, but more importantly, they would learn it while he helped save their lives. The moment was coming. He could see the flight attendants growing more desperate as they moved through the cabin, their earlier prejudices forgotten in the face of crisis. Soon they would reach him, and everything would change. The man they had judged so harshly was about to become their only hope for survival. The cockpit door swung open, and the captain emerged, his face ghostly pale. He stumbled slightly, gripping the doorframe for support. The first-class passengers watched in stunned silence as he doubled over, clearly in distress. The flight attendants rushed to help him, their faces twisted with worry. "Both of us," the captain managed to say between labored breaths. "Food poisoning from the crew meal." He pressed a hand against the wall to steady himself. "My co-pilot, he's worse." The lead flight attendant's professional composure cracked completely. Her hands shook as she helped the captain into an empty first-class seat. The other flight attendant rushed to get water and sick bags, all pretense of calm authority now gone. Passengers began to realize something was seriously wrong. Worried whispers spread through the cabin like wildfire. "Who's flying the plane?" someone asked, their voice tight with panic. The question hung in the air, heavy with fear. The lead flight attendant took a deep breath and addressed the first-class cabin, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation. Our flight crew is experiencing severe illness. Is there anyone here with flying experience? Any pilots on board?" Passengers exchanged frightened looks. A businessman raised his hand hesitantly. "I have a small private pilot's license, but I've never flown anything this big." The flight attendant's face fell. She hurried to the intercom. "If there are any passengers with commercial flying experience, please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately. This is urgent." The black passenger in seat 2A, the same man they'd been treating with suspicion all flight, watched this scene unfold calmly. He could have spoken up immediately, but he waited, observing as the flight attendants who had judged him so harshly now frantically searched for help. The aircraft lurched again, more violently this time. Warning lights flashed in the cockpit, visible through the open door. The engines made a sound that only a trained ear would recognize as troubling. He knew they were running out of time. Finally, he stood up. The same flight attendant who had been so cold to him earlier now barely glanced his way, probably assuming he was just another worried passenger. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "Sir, please remain seated," she said dismissively, her mind clearly on bigger problems. "We're handling an emergency." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his airline ID. "I'm a senior captain," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I'm rated on this aircraft type. I have over 15,000 hours of flight time." The flight attendant froze. She stared at his ID, then at his face, her eyes widening with recognition and shame. The other flight attendant, who had made the snide comments earlier, covered her mouth with her hand. The lead flight attendant stammered, her face flushing red. "I'm so sorry, sir. That's not important right now," he cut her off professionally. "We need to focus on the situation at hand. Tell me exactly what happened to the flight crew." As she explained about the food poisoning, he was already doing a mental inventory of what needed to be done. He could see through the cockpit door that the autopilot was engaged, but the warning lights suggested multiple systems needed attention. The sick captain looked up at him with relief. "You can fly her?" "Yes, sir," he replied, already removing his sweater to be more comfortable in the cockpit. "I flew this exact model last week. I'll need a complete briefing on your situation, and I'll need to contact air traffic control immediately." The passengers watched this exchange in stunned silence. The businessman who had been giving him sympathetic looks earlier now stared with open admiration. The young woman who had sat next to him smiled, though her eyes were still frightened. The lead flight attendant, now completely professional despite her obvious embarrassment, helped gather his belongings. "Sir, we treated you." Right now, we have more important things to worry about, he said firmly. I need you to keep the passengers calm and prepared for anything. Can you do that? She nodded vigorously, her earlier prejudices forgotten in the face of crisis. The other flight attendant began securing the cabin with new energy, throwing grateful glances his way. As he entered the cockpit, he quickly assessed the situation. The co-pilot was slumped in his seat, barely conscious. Warning lights indicated multiple system issues. The problems he'd been hearing in the engines were worse than he thought. He helped move the co-pilot to the cabin, then settled into the left seat. His hands moved automatically over the familiar controls, muscle memory taking over. The same flight attendants who had watched him suspiciously all flight now looked at him with desperate hope. I need a full passenger count, our current fuel status, and weather reports for all airports within our range, he said, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone who had handled emergencies before. And get me on the line with air traffic control immediately. The flight attendants rushed to comply, their earlier bias replaced by strict professionalism. As he strapped himself in and began checking instruments, he could hear them in the cabin, their voices now confident as they reassured passengers. He took a deep breath, his hands resting on the controls. The aircraft shuddered again, but his grip was steady. The lives of everyone on board now depended on him, the same man who, just hours ago, had been deemed suspicious and unwelcome in first class. But there was no time to dwell on irony. Right now, he had a plane to save. The cockpit felt like home to him, even under these circumstances. His fingers moved across the controls with practiced ease as he quickly assessed their situation. Warning lights painted the dark cockpit in an eerie red glow. Outside, storm clouds loomed ahead, making the challenging situation even more complex. Air traffic control is on line 2, the lead flight attendant said, her voice steady now, professional respect having replaced her earlier prejudice. He picked up the radio, his voice calm and authoritative. This is Flight 2937 declaring an emergency. Both pilots are incapacitated due to food poisoning. I am a commercial airline captain taking command of the aircraft. The controller's response came quickly. Roger, Flight 2937. Can you state your qualifications? He provided his credentials while simultaneously scanning the weather radar. The storm system ahead looked nasty. Exactly what they didn't need with failing engines and sick pilots. We're showing multiple system warnings, he reported to ATC. Engine 2 is showing irregular readings, and we're getting pressurization warnings. Requesting immediate vectors for the nearest suitable airport. The lead flight attendant returned to the cockpit with the information he requested. We have 221 passengers and 8 crew members. Current fuel is at 60% capacity. Thank you, he said, already calculating distances and alternatives in his head. I need you to prepare the cabin for a possible emergency landing. But do it calmly. We don't want to cause panic. She nodded, then hesitated. Sir, about earlier. Later, he said firmly but not unkindly. Right now, I need you focused on passenger safety. As she left, he turned his full attention to handling the aircraft. The engine vibration was getting worse, and he could feel the aircraft wanting to pull right. His experience told him they were losing power in the right engine, exactly what he'd suspected earlier when he was just a passenger. The radio crackled with the controller's voice. Flight 2937, we're showing Shannon International as your nearest suitable airport. Current distance 380 nautical miles. Roger that, he responded, already adjusting their heading. Request weather information for Shannon and any alternatives within range. The next few minutes were intense. He navigated through turbulence while programming the new route into the flight computer. Every movement had to be precise, every decision carefully weighed. The lives of 229 people depended on his skill and judgment. In the cabin, he could hear the flight attendants working efficiently, securing loose items and quietly preparing passengers for the possibility of an emergency landing. The same crew members who had treated him with suspicion were now executing his instructions with absolute trust. The aircraft shuddered again, harder this time. Warning indicators showed the right engine was deteriorating faster than he'd hoped. He needed to decrease altitude. Flying lower would put less strain on the failing engine and help with the pressurization issues. Flight 2937, descending to flight level 290, he reported to ATC. Request continuous weather updates for our route. We may need to deviate around this storm system. His mind was working on multiple levels, handling the immediate crisis while planning 3 steps ahead. Should the right engine fail completely, he'd need an immediate alternate plan. If the pressurization system deteriorated further, they'd need to descend even lower. The lead flight attendant returned to the cockpit. Cabin is secure, sir. The passengers are nervous but calm. The 2 pilots are resting in first class. They're still very ill but stable. Good, he replied, his eyes never leaving the instruments. Stay ready. If that engine goes completely, things will get very interesting very quickly. She watched him work for a moment, clearly amazed at his calm efficiency. The same man they'd viewed with suspicion was now their only hope for survival, and he was handling the crisis with remarkable skill and composure. Through the cockpit window, lightning flashed in the distance. The storm system loomed ahead like a wall of darkness. He studied the weather radar, looking for any gaps in the weather that might offer a smoother route. Flight 2937, be advised we're showing severe weather along your planned route, the controller warned. Recommend deviation 20 degrees south. He was already making the adjustment, his movements smooth and confident. Years of training and experience had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation. Every challenge that arose, the failing engine, the storm, the pressurization issues, he met with professional calm and precise action. In the cabin, a young child started crying, and he could hear a flight attendant gently comforting them. The same flight attendant who had made snide comments about him earlier was now channeling his calm demeanor, helping keep passengers relaxed despite the obvious tension. Another warning light flickered on the panel. The right engine's temperature was climbing faster than he liked. He reduced power further, compensating with the left engine to maintain their course. It was like a complex dance, balancing multiple failing systems while navigating through increasingly hostile weather. Shannon approach, Flight 2937, he radioed. Request emergency priority landing. We're showing continuing deterioration in our right engine and may need immediate clearance. The response was immediate. Flight 2937, you are cleared for priority handling. All emergency services will be standing by. Continue present heading. He felt a slight vibration in the controls that told him the right engine was reaching a critical point. They were still over an hour from Shannon, and every minute counted. But his face remained calm, his hands steady on the controls. He trained for this, prepared for this, and now all that experience was being put to the ultimate test. The lead flight attendant watched him from the cockpit doorway, her earlier prejudices forgotten in the face of his obvious expertise. The man they had judged so quickly was now demonstrating a level of skill and professionalism that left her in awe. Lightning flashed again, closer this time. The storm lay ahead like a challenge, but he was ready. With steady hands and unwavering focus, he prepared to guide the troubled aircraft through the worst of the weather, determined to bring everyone safely to the ground. Shannon Airport appeared through the rain-streaked windshield, its runway lights piercing through the stormy darkness like a lifeline. They were 20 minutes out, but those 20 minutes would be the most challenging of his entire flying career. The right engine was now running on borrowed time, and the storm wasn't making things any easier. Cabin crew, prepare for landing, he announced over the intercom, his voice projecting a confidence that helped keep everyone calm. The same flight attendants who had dabbered him hours ago now moved through the cabin with renewed purpose, drawing strength from his steady leadership. The lead flight attendant returned to the cockpit. Cabin is secure, sir. All passengers are in brace position. Emergency services are standing by on the ground. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the instruments. The right engine's temperature was now critically high, and warning lights covered the panel like angry stars. Each movement of the controls had to be perfect. There would be no second chances. Flight 2937, Shannon approach, the radio crackled. Winds 220 at 35 knots, gusting to 45. Runway 24 is clear and waiting. Emergency vehicles in position. Roger, Shannon, he responded, already adjusting their approach angle to compensate for the strong crosswind. The storm had turned the normally routine landing into something far more complicated. A violent shudder ran through the aircraft. The right engine's warning tone changed pitch. a sound every pilot dreads. Loss of power on engine 2, he reported calmly to ATC, switching to single-engine approach. The passengers felt the aircraft tilt as he compensated with the remaining engine. In the cabin, someone started praying quietly. A child whimpered, and a mother's soothing voice could be heard. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seatbelts one final time, their faces tense but professional. Lightning flashed, illuminating the clouds around them. Rain hammered against the windshield as they descended through the storm. The aircraft bucked in the turbulence, but his hands remained steady on the controls, making constant minor adjustments to keep them on course. 10 miles out, he announced to the cabin crew, "Brace positions." The lead flight attendant's voice echoed through the cabin, "Brace, brace. Heads down, stay down." The same voice that had questioned his presence in first class now carried absolute trust in his abilities. Through the rain, he could see the approach lights marking their path to safety. But the crosswind was trying to push them off course, and with only one working engine, every gust required immediate correction. His world narrowed to the instruments before him and the runway ahead, years of training crystallizing into these crucial moments. 500 feet, the aircraft's automated system announced. The runway threshold passed beneath them. Almost simultaneously, the right engine gave a final sickening groan and went completely silent. "Engine 2 failure," he reported, his voice still remarkably calm. "Committing to landing." The ground came up to meet them, wind buffeting the aircraft from all sides. In the cabin, the flight attendants' voices could be heard. "Brace, brace, brace." He fought the controls, compensating for the dead engine while dealing with the crosswind. The aircraft wanted to yaw right, but he wouldn't let it. Every ounce of his experience and skill focused on keeping the massive aircraft aligned with the runway. The main wheels touched down hard. There was no way to make it gentle under these conditions. The reverse thrust from the remaining engine was asymmetrical, trying to push them off the runway, but he was ready for it. His feet danced on the rudder pedals, fighting to keep them straight. Rain-slicked tarmac rushed past as he applied maximum braking. Through the windshield, he could see emergency vehicles racing alongside, their lights flashing through the rain. The aircraft shuddered and groaned as it slowed, but he kept it firmly on the centerline. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity but was really less than a minute, the aircraft slowed to a safe taxi speed. He guided it clear of the runway, bringing it to a stop in the designated emergency area. Emergency vehicles surrounded them immediately, their lights painting the rain in red and blue. Only then did he allow himself to take a deep breath. He performed the emergency shutdown checklist from memory, his movements still precise despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The lead flight attendant appeared in the cockpit doorway, tears of relief in her eyes. "Sir, that was," she started, but words failed her. In the cabin, spontaneous applause erupted as the passengers realized they were safely on the ground. The flight attendants, who hours ago had treated him with suspicion, now looked at him with a mixture of admiration and shame. He stood up from the captain's seat, his legs slightly shaky from the intensity of the landing. Through the cabin door, he could see passengers hugging each other, some crying, others laughing with relief. The businessmen who had witnessed their earlier treatment of him now stood and started clapping, leading to a standing ovation. Emergency teams were already boarding to check on the sick pilots and ensure everyone was okay. The flight attendants coordinated the evacuation calmly and efficiently, their earlier prejudices forgotten in the face of his profound skill and professionalism. As he stepped into the cabin, passengers reached out to shake his hand or pat his shoulder. The young mother whose child he'd heard crying earlier hugged him spontaneously, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving my baby." The same flight attendants who had questioned his presence in first class now stood at attention, showing him the respect they should have shown from the beginning. Their faces showed the heavy weight of their earlier behavior, but also profound gratitude for his skill and forgiveness. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Shannon Airport's main terminal, where passengers from Flight 2937 gathered to board their replacement aircraft. The events of the previous night had made international headlines. Passenger pilot saves aircraft after emergency, hero in first class, prejudice to praise at 35,000 feet. The airline's CEO had flown in personally to handle the situation. He stood now in the terminal, addressing the assembled passengers and crew. Behind him, the pilot who had saved their lives stood quietly, still wearing his casual sweater and jeans. "What happened on this flight goes beyond heroism," the CEO began. "It's a powerful reminder about prejudice and professionalism." The very person some crew members initially judged turned out to be the most qualified person on that aircraft to save everyone's lives. The flight attendants who had treated him with suspicion now sat in the front row, their faces showing a mix of shame and gratitude. The lead flight attendant had tears in her eyes as she listened to the CEO's words. "But more than that," the CEO continued, "it's about how one person chose to rise above prejudice and help the very people who had dismissed him. When crisis struck, he didn't hesitate. He didn't let their earlier treatment affect his willingness to help. He showed us what true professionalism looks like." In the crowd, the young mother from the flight held her child close, remembering how calm his voice had been during the emergency landing. The businessman who had witnessed everything from across the aisle nodded in agreement with the CEO's words. The airline announced immediate changes to their training programs. Anti-bias training would become mandatory for all staff, and this incident would be used as a case study. The flight attendants who had shown prejudice weren't fired. Instead, at the pilot's own request, they would help develop and lead these new training sessions, sharing their experience and what they have learned. Local media gathered for a press conference, where the pilot spoke briefly about the incident. "This isn't just about one flight or one emergency," he said quietly. "It's about the assumptions we make about each other and how those assumptions can blind us to the incredible capabilities of the people around us." Several major airlines reached out, asking him to speak at their training programs. His story would be used to teach future aviation professionals about both technical skills and human behavior. He agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to create positive change in the industry he loved. The lead flight attendant approached him after the press conference, her eyes still showing the weight of her earlier behavior. "I'll never forget this," she said softly. "Not just the landing, but how you treated us with respect even after how we acted. You could have reported us, had us fired." He shook his head. "That wouldn't solve anything. Change doesn't come from punishment, it comes from understanding. Use this experience to help others learn. That's how we make things better." The airline's investigation revealed that his actions had saved more than just the flight. His early recognition of the engine problems, even while just a passenger, had prevented a potentially worse situation. If he hadn't taken control when he did, the outcome could have been tragically different. In the weeks that followed, letters poured in from passengers and their families. Many shared how the incident had changed their own perspectives about prejudice and judgment. The young woman who had sat next to him in first class wrote about how the experience had inspired her to start a program addressing bias in her own workplace. The businessman from the flight wrote an article for a major newspaper describing how watching the incident unfold had changed his understanding of prejudice in professional settings. "Sometimes our heroes don't look like what we expect," he wrote. "And that's exactly why we need to stop expecting anything based on appearance." 6 months later, the airline invited him back to their training center. The same flight attendants who had once shown him prejudice now worked alongside him, sharing their story with new recruits. Their honest accounts of their behavior and how their perspectives had changed became a powerful tool for teaching others. The pilot continued his regular job, flying the same routes, wearing the same uniform. But something had changed in how people saw him, and more importantly, in how they saw themselves and their own biases. A year after the incident, he received a letter from a young black student in aviation school. "Your story showed me that we can change things," the student wrote. "Not just by being good at what we do, but by how we handle the prejudice we face. Thank you for showing us that the best response to prejudice isn't anger, but excellence." The flight became more than just a story of an emergency landing. It became a lesson about judgment, professionalism, and the power of rising above prejudice. In aviation schools across the country, students now learn not just about the technical skills that saved the flight, but about the human elements that made the story so powerful. The last line of the official incident report summed it up perfectly. "The events of Flight 2937 remind us that expertise, courage, and professionalism know no color." The only barriers that truly matter are the ones we create in our own minds.